My name is Keith, and I am co-founder of Execution Labs. Execution Labs has been around for 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years, and hey, Mike. So we started out as, I guess, what most people will call an incubator for early stage game studios, and then we sort of evolved to a little bit more of an accelerator model. The last couple of years, more or less, we've been an early stage investor, seed stage investor, so we're very hands-on with the studios we invest in. We've only ever invested in game studios, so we don't do tech or e-commerce or whatever. It's just game studios, right, and only content. So that's what we do. And I wanted to start off sort of to dispel the notion that most investors, wait, first of all, how many people are developers in the room? Okay, so pretty much everybody. And is anyone looking for funding right now? Okay, well, it explains why you're here. Okay, great. So that gives me some context. So, I know it can seem when you're pitching investors that are, dominant stance is no, you can't have any money. But the reality is that investors, particularly early stage investors, have a really hard time deploying capital in game studios. And so any excuse to do it, we will. So we really want studios to present well and provide a good business case for us to provide that capital. So our inclination is to say yes, right? But there are a lot of things that studios do, especially early stage game studios, that are repeatable and are sort of automatic disqualifiers, or at least make it a lot harder for you to get capital. So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what some of those things are, and then sort of end with a sort of a high level, well, actually a bit of a meaty sort of thought process that hopefully will help you as you're out there seeking capital. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about, which is really critical, is the notion of stages. And stages in equity investment, right, which is what we do. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference in equity investment and royalty investment a little bit later. But stages is really critical. So in the traditional equity investor sort of framework, stage refers to the point of a company's growth at which you will invest. Meaning you'll hear some labels thrown around, so you'll hear seed investor, and that usually means you're investing in a company or studio that hasn't made any revenue yet, seed level. And then you'll hear early stage, which is an investor who invests past the first product, but not so far along the company's growth. And then you'll hear growth investors and so on and so on. And what's critical to know here is that you may read articles about investments or M&A or whatever that's happening in the games industry, and you say, oh, I should go talk to that investor. But the reality is, if you're seeking capital for the first time, the only category that's going to be interested in talking to you are seed investors, right? Because the growth and the early stage investors aren't going to ever write you a check, right? So it may seem like they're within your target, but they're really not. So that will eliminate a lot of no's. First of all, is sort of narrowing down who you can possibly talk to. The second way stage is important is very specific to games, right? And so, as you know, as game developers, we talk about game development in terms of things like pre-production, production, pre-alpha, alpha, beta, right? And so these are stages of production. And publishers or royalty investors think about stages this way, right? So it's not about studio growth, it's about where the project is. And similar to equity investors, you can sort of automatically disqualify yourself from ever getting investment from a publisher by being at the wrong stage. And it's really incumbent upon you to understand where different publishers invest. And sadly, for game studios, there are very few investors, publishers, who will invest at design phase, right? Like, you'll very rarely be able to walk into a publisher's office with, design docs and some concept art and get a deal. It does happen, it can. Fewer, there are still, some people like us who will invest after a prototype. But most investors, particularly if you're doing mobile, is everyone here just mobile? So there's a little bit, yeah, everywhere. Well, my case, yeah. Although I would argue that. I mean, it depends on. So particularly with mobile and free-to-play, most publishers these days will only write you a check at or near beta, meaning you're about to go into soft launch, right? Which is kind of nuts, right? Because you basically do all this work that you pay for, but understanding that going in will really change the way you think about how you're going after investment. If you can't walk into most publishers' offices with a free-to-play mobile game and say, hey, we have this great idea, they'll say, great, come back when you're done. Right? That's essentially the mindset for the vast majority of publishers out there right now. So understanding that and understanding which publishers will invest at earlier stages is something that's going to be really critical for you if you think you're going to go out and try to get money early on. All right, so that's stages. Another thing that's really can be a deal breaker is your core. And I don't mean core technology, but I mean your core people. And the founding core of your studio, right? So it doesn't, when I say something is wrong with your core, it doesn't mean that any one of you is deficient in some way, but it means that the core of your team is not up to the task or hasn't demonstrated that they're up to the task that they're pitching for. So a prime example, and this is one we get a lot, is ex-AAA console developers. Right? So let's say you're an ex-AAA console developer. You've been working for Ubisoft for 15 years and you've worked on Assassin's Creed 7 or whatever. Right? So that's great. If you're a designer, you've been doing that, fantastic. But if your entire team is ex-AAA console and you're coming to me and you're pitching for seed stage capital, there's very little in your core team that indicates you're going to be ready to perform in a situation where capital and resources are extremely limited. Because seed stage capital doesn't mean you're going to have all the money you need to do everything you want. It's going to mean you're very capital constrained and resource constrained. And typically what we see is those who have been working for EA or Ubisoft or whatever for 15 years aren't used to having to sweep the floors themselves and all those other things. So fundamentally, if there's not someone in your core team who has shown that they can be scrappy and work on limited resources, that's a huge red flag for us. Now, the flip side of that coin is, let's say you are a successful indie, right? And you've been working scrappy for years and you've got a couple of games out and your last game was a tidy little, 6-hour platformer and it did well and whatever. That's great. Fantastic. I like where you are so far. But if you're telling me that what you really want to do is build a cross-platform MMO, then my red flag goes up. Who on your core team has shown the ability to scale a game and a business, right? If there's no one there, chances are you're not getting that check. So when you think about what you're building as a studio, think about who on your core team is capable of sort of checking that box for investors, right? Because that's really an easy way for us to say no. This is all feeding into this notion of a thesis, right? And so, a long time ago when I was in university and I was graduating, I wrote a thesis when I was studying Middle English literature, which is super helpful as an investor. So I wrote a thesis, but that's a different kind of thesis. When we talk about investor thesis, we're talking about something else. An investor thesis essentially is a framework that helps an investor narrow the scope of possible investments they might make. So just because we are game investors doesn't mean we will invest in all games. So for example, Execution Labs has been very vocal about the fact that we are looking for game studios who are really looking at community and social and spectation in a really interesting way. That's effectively our investment thesis. We also only invest in Europe and North America. Our check sizes are a few $100,000, right? Those are the sort of the size of studios we're looking for. That's the kind of game, the kind of studio. That's roughly our investment thesis. And generally, equity investors are very open about this kind of stuff in public because it makes it easier for us to get more people across the table who are pitching something that we may be interested in, right? So this is not a secret that we keep like under our desk, like in the glass box. Like this is something that's we're usually pretty vocal about. Most investors are. So the same thing applies actually to royalty investors, publishers. They don't necessarily call it an investment thesis, but it's pretty easy to figure out what kind of games they are focusing on. So to use an example, Paradox Interactive, right? Chances are they're looking to invest in systems-driven strategy games, right? They don't say that, hey, that's our investment thesis, But if you look around and see their portfolio, the vast majority of them are strategy games, right? So if you have a really nice puzzle platformer and you go and pitch Paradox, chances are they're going to say no because you're out of their investment thesis, right? It doesn't matter how good your game is or how good your studio is. So trying to do a little bit of homework ahead of time and figuring out, sort of the general sort of thesis for these publishers, it's going to save you and them a lot of time and a lot of disappointment, frankly. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't get some of these meetings, right? Because particularly larger publishers and larger investors, they have people running around whose job it is to take meetings, right? Because just because you may be out of thesis now doesn't mean that 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, that you won't be out of their thesis, right? And so they will interview you there in their CRM tool, and they will track you forever. But you'll be in their little system, right? So you may get the meeting and you may think, great, I'm getting a meeting, but you're not getting a yes, right? So understanding their thesis is super critical. Another example that I've spoken about quite a bit is this notion of arbitrage, specifically with mobile free-to-play games, since this is primarily a mobile conference, the notion of CPI. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to pour myself a glass of water here. So CPI arbitrage. So the concept of arbitrage, if you're not familiar, is basically the idea that you can buy one good at one price, turn it around and sell it, either in that same market or a different market for a higher price and make a margin, right? That's arbitrage. You're selling the same thing. You're buying something and selling it again. And so a lot of the pitches that we've received in mobile over the last few years have essentially been what we would call CPI arbitrage opportunities. It's the notion that I can spend money on a CPI basis, buy a user, and then monetize that user with an LTV that's higher than what I paid and make a margin on that, right? We have never once invested in a studio with that kind of game. Fundamentally, we've always thought that CPI prices would rise. It's not a sustainable business model. So you may have a neat idea, great art, great concept, but if it's essentially CPI arbitrage, we're always going to say no. That's out of our thesis. So I just hope that clarifies that notion a little bit. All right. So I've hinted at the fact that royalty investors and equity investors are different. What I mean is the money that you get from an equity investor is fundamentally different than the money you get from a publisher. So there are a lot of reasons for this, but the core of the issue is equity investors, as a rule, are very long-term focused, particularly early-stage investors, right? If we're giving you money at a seed stage, we are not looking short-term. We are looking at your studio 7 years down the road, more or less, right? And different equity investors have different time horizons they look at. But it's certainly not today, it's certainly not next year, certainly not the year after that. And critically, we are not betting on your game. We are betting on your company, right? That has a lot of implications, and I'll get back to that. Royalty investors, publishers, as a rule, don't care so much about your company. They care about your game. They're investing in your project, right? So their business is, let me put some money into this game, this project, right? I'll make a little margin on that. Hopefully everyone makes a little bit of money, and we do it, rinse and repeat, right? That's their business model. The equity investor business model is quite different. Most early stage and even later equity investors, VCs, right? We're not interested in bets that can yield a little bit of margin. Because the people who invest in us, usually those are called LPs or limited partners, they don't care about that either. If they want to make a little bit of margin on something, they can find other investment vehicles for doing that. The reason they put money into VCs is because they want to see potentially huge bets, right? So the model for most equity investors is that, listen, every bet we take has to have the potential to be huge, massive. It doesn't matter if a lot of them go to zero, but we're going to offset that by the one or two that really go big. So think about what that implies from a studio standpoint, right? you're out pitching, and you go to a publisher and say, hey, we have this great game. Seems like there's a niche to fill here. This game is going to cost £1 million. We think we can make $1.5 million after we pay the app stores. We make a little bit of money here, right? A lot of publishers will say, yeah, okay, sign me up. That sounds pretty good. I can live with that. If you go to an equity investor with that pitch, we can't do anything with it. Because the incremental $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, it's not meaningful to the business, right? So it's really important to think about that from the core team standpoint. Because if you are taking money from an equity investor, it means that you plan to exit that business down the road. So if an equity investor is looking at your business 5, 6, 7 years later, right? There's only one way for us to get money out of your business. Well, there's really a couple of ways. One is if you IPO, if you go public, which almost never happens in games. The other, and the more likely scenario, is that you get acquired, right? Or someone buys the majority of your company and I can cash out what I own. So, as a core team, if you are not prepared to eventually sell your business and work for someone else for some period of time, which is probably what's going to happen if you get acquired by a larger publisher, you should not be talking to equity investors, because that's how we get paid. Now, royalty investors, publishers, I'm not saying they don't look at your business and your studio and want to create a lasting partnership, because there are a lot of commercial benefits to doing that, right? They know who you are, so if you make a game, you have a good relationship, you can make another game, they trust you, etc. And that de-risks them a lot, it de-risks you a lot, you're comfortable, you're happy. But those are really individual decisions that they make. Each game is a new game, Maybe you sign a 2-game deal or whatever. But they don't care if you exit in 7 years, right? They just want you to make more games. Now, there's nothing in the world wrong with running a game studio built for that. In fact, most game studios are built for that. You make a game, you get some publisher money, hopefully you all make money, you have enough money to make another game. It's a pretty good life in some cases, right? Nothing wrong with that. But it does mean you shouldn't be talking to equity investors. Now, there's a big caveat here, which is that equity investors will look at your studio if you're making sort of smaller games that can make a little margin, if there's a larger goal in mind. So we talk about that in the way we talk about constructing a building. We talk about scaffolding. So we always talk to our studios about scaffolding. Meaning, what are you building today that provides scaffolding for a bigger business down the road? So, as an example, you come to me and say, hey, we're just starting out. We've got this prototype for this, mobile platformer. It's going to cost $500,000. And we do some capital. I like your core team. All those things. That's fine. Assuming that there's another part of that story. The other part of that story has to be, okay, we're building this platformer on mobile because we were building an Unreal and we need to learn Unity, right? Making this up. Our next game is a free-to-play mobile game that's going to use the same IP or the same mechanics, but we're going to add more staff, we're going to scale. The third game is going to be cross-platform PC, mobile, console, and so that's what I'm interested in hearing. That's the story that equity investors need to hear. So if that first game you're building gets you to that second game, that's an equity story, right? But we're not making any money off that first game. And by the way, we don't want you to give us any because we want you to put that back into the studio, right? That's a very, very different mindset. So, the key thing here is understanding what it means for your business and understanding how you tell your story is probably the biggest thing you can do before you ever sit across a table from an investor, either on the royalty side, the publisher side, or the equity side. And with that, I'll open the floor to questions. If there's anything I talked about today that you need sort of more clarification on, send me a note. I'm happy to reply. There were some sort of meaty issues in here, so feel free to poke me with questions now. And I'll send you the deck if you want, although it's not super helpful because it's mostly just pictures. Yes, please.
Hey, thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
Just interested in what are the most important figures you look at from a potential?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
What are the most important figures?
The most important figures. Well, we're seed stage investors, right? So normally there are no figures to look at. And if you gave them to me, I probably wouldn't believe you anyway. We don't look at revenue projections and try to do some discounted cash flow based on, that's not the way early stage investors work. It's never about, look, every deck has, this is the overall market for, first person shooters, and we think we can take 10% of this market, and fine, great, I'm happy you've done your research, but I just ignore that because it's all BS, right? I want to know what your core team is, I want to know what your capabilities are, and I want to know what your vision for your company is, and this is not unique to us, everyone uses this term, but what's your unfair advantage, right? What are you doing that other people aren't doing? What do you have as a studio that allows you to succeed in this super hyper competitive market? Those are the things we look at. It's not about your projected revenues over a 4-year whatever, and especially not what do I think my CPI is going to be, because as I said earlier, that's a disqualifier for us. We're not investing in those businesses.